In the last episode, we discussed about how trauma rewires the brain in a way that we begin to behave irrationally or hyper emotionally because the energy or the negative energy impacted on the person's integrity is stored within the mid and the lower brain, causing them to react irrationally or hyper emotionally during an incident or any situation that they encounter in life. And usually it begins with the trigger that actually is associated with that particular trauma, causing them to react in a way that is not acceptable in a particular time or in a particular place. The trauma can be over for many years, but once that pain is not being processed, that pain is not being transformed, it can linger into the person's life and then creates these symptoms that we've discussed in the previous episode to pop up or to come up. And if it's not been properly processed or dealt with, it can still affect the person's actions or moral behavior. Especially in the case of the seminarians, it can affect their moral behavior or moral character as the seminarian, or as a student, it can also affect the behavior too. And so, looking at trauma as a particular entity that affects the human person, it is important that we know how to deal with them, because of all the people born into the world, we have our own particular little or big experience of trauma, either any time in our life, as a child, as a baby, or even as an adolescent, a youth, or even as an adult, depending on the life events that you come across in your life. And so it is important that we know how to deal with them. And so let me just back up a bit in what trauma does to the brain. The trauma, actually, when it happens in that particular instance, it locks you into the survival mode in the mid and the lower brain, causing you to create a bypass from your rational or thinking brain to actually control the situation that you find yourself in. And because of that, we often react irrationally or even emotionally, excessively emotion in that particular situation. And it makes us really cause a lot of problem, if you can say. Because of that reality, this famous priest, Franciscan priest, Father Robert Rohr, once coined this very beautiful statement: a pain that is not transformed is transferred. In other words, the trauma that is experienced by a person, if it's not being dealt with, healed, or transformed, then there is 100% likely chance or 99.9% likely chance of that person transferring it to any person close to him. If it's in the family, it will be the father transferring it to the children by reacting emotionally or hyper emotionally, and then causing trauma again to their children in that regard. It comes in, for example, in the time of discipline of a kid. If the father is not transforming his pain in childhood, then the next he can able to transfer it to the children. Although as a human being, it is very important that as human beings we have free will, we can still moderate those, but majority of the human being, they do it unknowingly and they transfer the pain. And so in this particular segment, I want us to just look at some practical ways in which we can deal with the trauma on a proactive sense and also from a reactive sort of approach, if you can say. From a proactive standpoint, it is important that we first recognize our own trauma, and to recognize also the potential it has once it's not been transformed, that we can actually transfer the pain to the generation that comes after. Now, this is our students or our children or whoever that we are in directly contact with. When we are cornered to a particular situation, the traumatic attitude can actually cause us to harm and transfer the pain to others. So, how do we do it in a proactive level? First is the awareness. We just need to have the awareness. And so, from my personal level, I have to be aware of my own past, my own trauma, and to recognize the symptoms that are actually surfacing in my life as I live my normal daily life, because the trauma can actually create certain symptoms, that some of which I've already mentioned, to surface in our daily activities, in our encounter with others. So the awareness of that is very important, to recognize that we have, to recognize the symptoms and that when they pop up, and to also to recognize the triggers that actually can cause you to react in a certain way because of your traumatic past. And that is a very important way of actually dealing with your own trauma. Having the awareness is not enough, but it's also important that the person processes their information, their pain. And that is why it comes in the second point, that is counseling. Counseling is the avenue which we make to allow the person to tell the story of his own pain. And by telling the story of his own pain, what happens in the brain is that you allow your higher brain now to have an understanding of where the pain is. And once your brain begins to know where the pain is and begin to aware of the intensity of the pain there is in your traumatic past, then the higher brain begins to take the control and begin to have moderation over the emotions that are locked in there. And that is why it is important that you have to find a counselor, a trauma counselor, or somebody whom you can talk freely without any judgment, to allow you to empty yourself, discussing the painful events, painful experience, so that you can have inner healing, so to speak, both in your spirit as well as in your mind. And from a biological standpoint, it is the moment of counseling that allows your higher brain to have the control over the information that is locked in the lower and the midbrains. And so that is why counseling is very important as a tool to help you transform the pain that you have that is traumatic to you. Once you're able to transform that, then you are less likely to transfer it, because you can now allow your higher brain to have the control over the emotional route as well as your instinctual responses, and begin to moderate them and direct them in the proper way. In that sense, you begin to adjust and behave in the proper way, even if the trigger situations arises in your daily life. And that is the important about proactive means. In terms of the proactive means from an institutional point of view, we should provide counseling services to be available for students in the schools, for example, so that they can have a moment in which they process their own painful traumatic experiences. In the seminary, we have a process we call spiritual direction, which is an internal forum in which the student, unpacks and, talks about its pain and stuff like that, so that the teacher or the priest or the formator could help him process those things. And by processing them and discussing them, already the student or the person is beginning to transform his own pain. It is a process. It's not a thing that you achieve in the twinkling of an eye. It is a process, so it takes time for the person to begin to befriend his experience and be able to make the right decisions, to make choices that are very important in his moral behavior and how he relates to others for that regard. So that is the importance, and also to make sure that you, from the counseling point of view, it is also important as spiritual being that we enter whatever the experience that we have now, we transcend the pain through bring it into your spiritual life, for example, in prayer. And when you put those things in prayer, you begin to understand yourself more as a human person. And when you begin to love the experience and the pain that you have, bringing them to the light, the cross of Christ, as being the person who understood more our pain, helps us to, image our life with the life of Christ. It helps by giving us the grace to make the transformation and the inner healing made possible. In that way, we can be able to order our moral behavior and our characters more in the right way, and to avoid transferring our pain into the next generation, either be your children or those students that you are teaching, or in whatever situation that you find yourself. So that's the whole episode, as I've mentioned in the beginning. I shared with you that I'm talking about human formation in the seminary, and a particular issue that affects the human person is trauma, and how trauma affects the brain, and then how it presents itself in the life of the person or the student, and how we should recognize it and what we should do with it to practically remove the pain that is hidden inside over a long, long time. And by transforming those pains, we actually help the person to grow in a human way, and we can relate more properly with others. Thank you too much for listening.